Good morning. Thank you very much to the conference organizers for including me in this panel. I very much look forward to the other talks during the conference. My name is Nick Choquette-Levy. I'm a PhD candidate at Princeton University. And in this presentation, I'll share a little bit of information on a project that we're doing to look at how heterogeneity and access to informational and social capital influence smallholder farmers' climate adaptation, in part through how it shapes their perceptions of climate risk. This is a project that's done in collaboration with colleagues from Princeton University, the University of Michigan, and the Institute for Social and Environmental Research in Nepal. So as some initial motivation, over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of research looking at the impact of climate information services on smallholder farmers' climate adaptation strategies. And generally, this literature has found that overall farmers, for the most part, accurately perceive long-term climate trends, but that these perceived climate risks don't seem to translate necessarily to kind of observed adaptation actions. And so there's been a lot of government and non-governmental organization efforts to make climate information services like seasonal weather forecasts more accessible to farmers. But generally, that's been met with limited success at best. And so a couple of the key gaps in the literature that we're looking to fill is how does perception of climate change shape not just risk perceptions of farming, but also of other livelihood alternatives, including migration? And secondly, how does differential access to information sources and social networks mediate this relationship between climate risk perceptions and the likelihood of taking an adaptive action? And so the main research questions for this project are how salient is climate change to overall perceptions of livelihood risks? How is heterogeneity and access to information sources correlated with farmers' perceptions of climate risks? And then how do these perceptions of climate risks and livelihood alternatives shape kind of observable income diversification strategies? For example, remittances are earned through migration. And so as a case study for looking at these questions, we're looking at the agricultural sector in Nepal. And we think there's several reasons why this is an important case study for these types of questions. First, Nepal is highly vulnerable to several climate risks, including floods, droughts, and landslides. It's often at the top of many of these kind of overall climate vulnerability indicators. It's also highly dependent on the agricultural sector, and in particular, the subsistence farming sector, that accounts for roughly a quarter of its GDP and over 70% of its employment. At the same time, it's one of the fastest urbanizing countries in the world, and it's also a large source of outmigration to other parts of the world. And remittances from those international migrants back to Nepal account for 27% of its GDP, so also a huge part of its economic development story. Now, the government is putting in a lot of effort to understand how climate change is shaping agriculture. And in fact, they have a full census dedicated specifically to the impacts of climate change on farmers' perceptions of risks and their adaptation strategies. And that just got started this year. So hopefully there'll be some initial data released next year. But in conjunction with that national scale data collection effort, what we're hoping to do is focus in on one region called the Chitwan district in the southern plains area of Nepal. This is one of the main agricultural breadbaskets of the country. And we're hoping to kind of generate some more detailed information to kind of assess these questions of heterogeneity and access to information and social capital and how that translates to risk perceptions and adaptation actions. And so what we did is we conducted a household survey. So we did face-to-face surveys with farming households. Each survey lasted approximately an hour. We interviewed 500 households in the Chitwan district. 400 of those households were close to one of the two main rivers in the region, and 100 households were farther apart from those rivers. And the idea was to kind of stratify the samples so that we could get a variation in the types of climate risks that households are generally exposed to. And so the survey consisted of three main parts. We had a calendar in which we asked respondents for each year to report kind of the main livelihoods they invested in, things like what kind of crops did you plant? Did you invest in a new livestock? Did somebody from your household migrate? And then if so, for each of these livelihood strategies, roughly what was the income that you earned from each of those strategies in each year, ranging from 2015 to 2021. And then on top of that, we asked as well, for each of those years, did you experience any of a list of about 7 different climate-linked hazards, which I'll get into in the next slide. Following that, we had a series of Likert scale questions that were designed to get more information about households' overall perceptions of livelihood risks, how specifically their perceptions of climate risks, as well as the types of information sources they consulted and how frequently those were consulted, how much they trusted those sources, et cetera. And then finally, we had a section of the survey where we ran vignette experiments. So we read out hypothetical policy scenarios to respondents. So these could be things like cash transfer policies or crop insurance policies. And we asked respondents both before and after the vignette to rate the likelihood of adopting different types of livelihood strategies in the coming years. And so the idea was to get a sense of how would each of these policy strategies impact the types of livelihoods that farmers might choose to adopt in the coming years. And so to report a few kind of descriptive statistics, one of the first questions we asked was how important are each of several different risk factors to your economic success? And so those ranged from access to labor, your overall health, your access to finance, et cetera. And we also included two kind of factors related to weather or climate. So we asked about short-term weather conditions, which we defined as conditions lasting less than 2 weeks, and then long-term weather conditions, which were conditions lasting more than 2 weeks. And we used that as a proxy for overall climatic conditions. What we found is that more farmers rated kind of long-term weather conditions as highly salient to their economic success compared to any other risk factor. So that would suggest that climate tends to be highly salient to farming success in most farmers' minds, at least in this region. And then we followed that up with specific questions on over the next 5 years, how will the impact of different climate-linked hazards change? And so things like droughts, floods, access to groundwater, et cetera. So we asked farmers whether they thought it would increase in risk, decrease in risk, or stay about the same. What we found is that for most hazards, the majority of respondents found that these hazards would likely increase in risk over the coming years. So we found that climate seems to be highly salient, and most hazards are expected to get worse. Now, the next kind of series of questions we wanted to look at is how does access to different information sources affect your overall perception of climate risks? And so in this map, we've mapped out different information sources, which are represented by the bubbles. The size of the bubbles represent the proportion of the sample that reported consulting one of these sources at least once in the past year. The position on the x-axis represents how frequently do people consult these sources, ranging from less than monthly to more than monthly on average. The position on the y-axis represents the overall trust in these sources. So 1 would be low trust, 3 would be high trust in the sources. And then the color of the bubble represents for everybody that consulted these sources, what was their average climate risk perception on a scale from 1 to 6. And so what we found is kind of two main trends. On the one hand, there's a cluster of information sources that are generally kind of informal media, things like social media, conversations with local friends, conversations with friends living in a different city or country. Those tend to be consulted by a majority of the sample. They tend to be consulted frequently, and people who consult these sources tend to have kind of average climate risk perceptions. What's interesting is that there's another cluster of sources that tend to be more official or professional sources. So things like veterinarians, agricultural extension officers, religious leaders, et cetera. These tend to be consulted by a much smaller proportion of the population and less frequently. But among those who do consult these sources, they tend to have kind of lower climate risk perceptions than the average population. And that would suggest that the more information sources you access, and in particular, the more kind of government or official sources you access, perhaps the more confident you are that you or maybe your community has the necessary resources to cope with these climate risks. And so these risks might be kind of diminished in their importance compared to people who don't have access to those sources. So one of the next questions we asked about was how does climate affect perceptions, not just of farming risks, but of other kind of livelihood diversification strategies? So in this graph, we're showing several different livelihood strategies, and we ask households to rank kind of their perceived riskiness, ranging from highly risky in red to somewhat risky in gray and not risky in blue. What we found is that for farming strategies like farming cereal crops, a majority of households did find these to be highly risky. But what's interesting is that some of the more common diversification strategies like migration or off-farm wage labor were seen by a majority of households as even riskier than farming. And in kind of a follow-up econometric analysis, we wanted to see for different demographic variables and for your perceived climate risk, how does this drive kind of your perceived riskiness of different livelihood strategies? What we found is that there was a significant link between perceived climate risk and the perceived risk of farming, which is measured through cereal crops here. What's interesting is that there's an even more substantial positive relationship between perceived climate risk and your perceived riskiness of migration and off-farm wage labor. And so that might suggest that climate change is driving not just increased perceptions of farming risks, but also perceived riskiness of other common livelihood diversification strategies. And just as a check, we also looked at a strategy that presumably wouldn't be affected by climate change, so your pension income. And we, in fact, saw that there was no kind of significant link between climate risk perceptions and that perceived riskiness of that strategy. So that would kind of refute the hypothesis that maybe people who are generally worried about climate risk worry about everything. In fact, there seems to be kind of a real relationship there between climate risk perceptions and common livelihood diversification strategies. And then finally, we wanted to look at what factors influence income diversification. And so this pie chart shows kind of average across all households and across all years, how much of a typical household income is derived from these general livelihood buckets. And so we see, for example, that farming actually generates a relatively small proportion of household incomes, likely because most of what's farmed is just consumed by the household and not necessarily sold to market. What's interesting is that remittances from migration and income earned from off-farm labor actually constitute a pretty significant portion of household incomes. And so because we had kind of annual data for each household on the incomes they earn, we could do kind of a panel analysis of what factors are driving kind of year-to-year variation and how much income you're deriving from each of these sources. And so just to call your attention to two main results, we found that kind of on average, your perceived riskiness of different livelihood strategies is generally associated with you earning less of your income from that strategy. So for example, in migration, the more risky that you find migration to be, the less of your income you're likely to earn from migration remittances. One notable exception is farming, where there is a small but significant positive relationship. What's even more interesting, in my opinion, is that in years in which households were exposed to flood, so likely having a shock to their income, they actually relied even more on livelihoods they perceived to be risky for income. So for example, for off-farm wage labor, in years in which they experienced the flood, households that perceived these to be riskier actually ended up relying even more on these strategies compared to years in which there wasn't a flood. Or put another way, for any household that experienced a flood, those that perceived off-farm wage labor to be risky actually ended up relying more on that income. And so that might suggest a doubling down strategy in which households generally are risk averse and want to avoid livelihood strategies they find risky. But in years in which they experienced a shock, they might actually double down on those risky strategies in hopes of kind of making up the income they need to meet their basic needs. And so just to summarize some key insights, we saw that climate is highly salient to perceptions of livelihood risks. And that is salient not just to farming risk, but it might be contributing to increased perceptions of other income diversification strategies. And furthermore, farmers are generally reluctant to invest in livelihoods they find risky, like remittances or off-farm wage labor, but they might double down on those during extreme events. And so in future work, we want to disaggregate the effects of specific groups or information sources on climate risk perceptions and on adaptation strategies. We want to further disentangle the effect of these hypothetical policy interventions on future livelihood intentions. And then hopefully in a second wave of the survey, we can do more intensive focus group discussions to better understand what are the drivers of these risk perceptions of, these livelihood diversification strategies like migration and off-farm wage labor. So with that, I'd like to thank again the organizers, the staff, and co-authors that contributed to the study, and I'd be very happy to take any questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much.